Veteran Elias Thorne sought peace, but a snowstorm brought him a new battle. He found 3 German shepherds near death from the cold, but they were no ordinary strays. They bore old scars and cryptic tattooed symbols, proof of a brutal past. He hadn't just saved 3 lives. He'd unknowingly stolen prized assets from very dangerous men. Now the storm is over, but a deadly hunt has just begun. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, a sound Elias knew all too well. It rattled the single-pane window of his small log cabin, a fortress of solitude he had built with his own hands against a world he no longer understood. Outside, the Montana landscape had vanished, swallowed whole by a blizzard that had raged for 2 days straight. The snow wasn't just falling, it was a physical assault, a blinding white curtain that erased the jagged peaks and the tall pines that stood like silent sentinels around his property. Elias, a man carved from the same rugged timber as his home, stood by the stone fireplace, letting the heat seep into his bones. In his late 40s, he was tall and lean, with a quiet strength that hinted at a past filled with hardship. His short hair was threaded with silver, and his face, etched with lines of weariness, held a kindness in the eyes that he rarely let anyone see. He wore his cold weather uniform, an old unzipped leather jacket over a faded plaid shirt, a testament to years of use. His isolation in Silver Pines was a deliberate choice. After 2 tours and 15 years in the army, the noise of civilization had become unbearable. The ghosts of faraway deserts and fallen comrades were quieter here, their whispers often lost in the rustle of leaves or the rush of the creek. But in the suffocating silence of a blizzard, they grew louder. The rhythmic thump of the wind against the cabin walls sounded like mortar fire from a lifetime ago, and the flickering firelight cast shadows that danced like specters from his memories. He closed his eyes, taking a slow breath. The scent of burning pine grounded him in the present. It was 2026, not 2008. He was safe, he was alone, and that was how he liked it. But the storm was relentless, and a deep-seated instinct, honed by years of service, gnawed at him. Something was not right. It was a feeling more than a thought, a subtle shift in the rhythm of the gale. He needed to check the generator and the woodpile. Pulling on a thick woolen hat and heavy gloves, Elias braced himself and pushed the heavy cabin door open. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, driving icy needles into any exposed skin. He leaned into the gale, his world reduced to a few feet of churning white. The path to the woodshed was a faint depression in the snow. Each step was a battle. As he secured the tarp over the precious firewood, a sound cut through the storm's roar. Thin, desperate, he froze, straining to listen. It was a cry, high-pitched and mournful, almost human. For a moment, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him. Another ghost in the storm. But then it came again, weaker this time. A final plea swallowed by the blizzard. Duty overrode his desire for warmth and safety. He grabbed a powerful flashlight from the shed and began to trudge in the direction of the sound, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He found them less than 100 yards from his cabin, a huddled mound of gray and white fur, half buried in a snowdrift. At first, he thought it was just one animal, a deer perhaps, that had succumbed to the cold. But as he wiped the snow away, he saw not 1, but 3 German shepherds. They were magnificent animals, even in their wretched state, with thick coats of wolf gray and white. They looked to be young adults, but they were little more than skeletons, their bodies trembling violently from the cold. Their eyes were closed. Their breathing was shallow, their paws raw and bleeding. For a long moment, Elias just stared, his mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. His solitude was sacred. Bringing them in would shatter it. They were a complication, a responsibility he did not want. But as he looked at their still forms, at the ice clinging to their muzzles, he saw something else. He saw loyalty, courage, and a silent plea for help. They were soldiers left behind on a battlefield of ice and snow, and he could not abandon them. With a grunt, he gathered the first dog into his arms, the largest of the three. The animal was surprisingly light, its body limp. He carried it back to the cabin, the wind tearing at him, and gently laid it on the worn rug in front of the fireplace. He repeated the grueling trip twice more, his muscles screaming in protest, until all three dogs were lying in a row before the hearth. He worked quickly, his old training kicking in. He dried their fur with rough towels, the movements gentle but efficient. He checked for frostbite. His fingers probed their paws and ears. As the warmth of the fire began to penetrate their frozen bodies, they stirred, a low whine escaping from one of them. He brought them bowls of lukewarm water, and they drank weakly, their tongues lapping at the precious liquid. It was then, as he was gently cleaning a patch of matted fur on the neck of the largest dog, that he saw it. Underneath the fur, etched onto the skin, was a small, precise tattoo. A shield with the letters V7 inside. His blood ran cold. He checked the others. The second dog had the same mark. The third, a female slightly smaller than the rest, had it too, along with a long, silvery scar that ran down her flank. A perfectly straight line that could only have been made by a blade. He ran his hand over their bodies and felt the faint ridges of other healed wounds. Old battle scars hidden beneath their thick coats. These were not stray dogs. The tattoos, the scars, the disciplined way they endured his touch, even in their weakened state, it all pointed to one undeniable conclusion. They had been trained professionally. They were soldiers just like him. And just like him, they had been discarded, left for dead when their usefulness was over. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, a new, more dangerous storm was just beginning to gather. The storm broke on the fourth day. Sunlight, pale and thin, finally pierced the gray veil, spilling across a world remade in white. Inside the cabin, a fragile peace had settled. The three German shepherds, once near death, were now on the road to recovery. The transformation was remarkable. With food in their bellies and the constant warmth of the fire, their coats regained some of their luster, and their eyes, once dull with exhaustion, now held a bright, unnerving intelligence. Elias had given them names that suited their silent, watchful natures. The largest male, the clear leader of the trio, he called Spectre. His movements were fluid and economical, and he carried himself with a quiet authority that the others instinctively respected. The second male, slightly leaner and always at Spectre's flank, was Shade. He was the observer, his dark, intelligent eyes missing nothing, his presence so subtle he could seem to melt into the background. The female, the one with the long straight scar, was Vesper. She was the most alert, her ears constantly swiveling to catch the faintest sound, her posture a perfect picture of coiled readiness. In the days that followed the storm, Elias watched them, fascinated and deeply unsettled. They were not like any dogs he had ever known. They moved together with a coordinated grace that spoke of relentless training. When he let them outside into the deep snow, they didn't bound or play randomly. They moved tactically, clearing the area around the cabin in a sweeping circular pattern, always aware of each other's position. They responded not to spoken words, but to his posture, the slight tilt of his head, a gesture of his hand. It was a silent language he knew well, the language of soldiers in the field. The certainty of his initial assessment hardened into cold fact. These were military working dogs. His quiet, solitary life had been irrevocably breached. The cabin, once a silent refuge, now hummed with the quiet energy of three powerful animals. His supplies, meant to last him another month, were dwindling at an alarming rate. The dogs ate voraciously. their lean bodies demanding fuel to heal. The time had come to break his self-imposed exile and make the trip into Silver Pines. He loaded the three of them into the covered bed of his old rust-flecked pickup truck. They leaped in without hesitation and settled down immediately, as if they had done it 100 times before. The 20-minute drive into town was slow, the road still slick with packed ice. Silver Pines was a small town nestled in a mountain valley, a collection of wooden storefronts that looked like they hadn't changed much since 1950. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business. And Elias, the reclusive veteran who lived up on the ridge, was a subject of quiet curiosity. His arrival did not go unnoticed. As he pulled up in front of the general store, heads turned. It wasn't just his presence, but the three magnificent gray and white shepherds sitting silently in the back of his truck that drew their stares. He ignored the looks, his focus on the task at hand: dog food, flour, coffee, and a few other essentials. He had just finished loading his purchases when a shadow fell over him. "Elias, haven't seen you in a while." Elias straightened up slowly and turned. Sheriff Hagen stood there, his hand resting casually on his belt. Hagen was a man in his 50s, with a stocky build that was starting to go soft around the middle. His uniform was crisp, his mustache neatly trimmed, and his face held a look of bland authority, but his eyes, small and dark, were sharp. They missed nothing. "Sheriff," Elias acknowledged with a curt nod. "Heard the storm hit you folks up the mountain pretty hard," Hagen said, his voice smooth. "Glad to see you made it through." "All right." He gestured with his chin toward the truck. "Quite the welcoming committee you've got there. New additions?" "You could say that," Elias said, his tone giving nothing away. "Town ordinance says any new animals have to be registered down at my office," Hagen continued, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Just a formality. Make sure they're up to date on their shots. Where'd you pick them up?" The question was casual, but it felt pointed. "Found them," Elias said simply. Hagen's gaze sharpened. "Found them up on the ridge during the storm? That's mighty lucky for them. No tags, I assume?" "No tags," Elias confirmed. He felt a familiar prickle on the back of his neck, the feeling of being interrogated. Hagen's questions were too precise, his interest too keen. This wasn't a small-town sheriff making friendly conversation. This was a man searching for something. "Well, you bring them by sometime this week," Hagen finished, clapping Elias lightly on the shoulder. "We'll get the paperwork sorted." He walked away without another word, leaving Elias with a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He didn't know that their entire exchange had been watched from the window of the Silver Pines diner. Clara Reed sat in a booth, a half-empty coffee cup and a laptop in front of her. She was in her early 30s, with sharp, intelligent features and dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore a sensible down vest over a sweater, an outfit that tried to blend in, but couldn't quite hide the sharp, focused energy of a city journalist. She was supposed to be writing a human interest piece on the slow decline of rural mountain towns, a story about fading traditions and quiet dignity. It was proving to be incredibly boring. But what she had just witnessed was not boring at all. She knew who Elias was, the town's resident hermit and war hero, and she knew Sheriff Hagen, the seemingly placid lawman who ran Silver Pines with a firm hand. The tension in their brief conversation had been palpable. It was in the rigid set of Elias's shoulders and the probing nature of the sheriff's questions. It was a scene that didn't fit the sleepy narrative of the town. Her reporter's instinct, long dormant, flared to life. There was a story here, a real story, and it had something to do with three beautiful, mysterious dogs. 2 days after his unsettling encounter with Sheriff Hagen, Elias was splitting logs when the sound of an engine disturbed the mountain silence. It was a low, determined rumble, a sound that did not belong in his world. He lowered the axe and stood perfectly still, his body tense. Spectre, shade, and Vesper, who had been lying in a patch of weak afternoon sun, were instantly on their feet. They didn't bark or growl. They simply stood, a formidable line of gray and white, their bodies radiating a calm, lethal readiness as they watched the narrow, winding track that served as his driveway. A small, dark green SUV, its tires caked with mud and snow, carefully navigated the final turn. It came to a stop, a respectful distance from the cabin. The engine cut out, and the sudden silence felt heavy. A woman got out. It was the journalist from the diner. Elias recognized her immediately. She had the same sharp, focused look, the same practical ponytail, and she wore the same down vest, though now it was zipped against the chill. She stood by her car for a moment, her gaze taking in the rustic cabin, the towering pines, and the three silent dogs that stood between her and the front door. She did not seem intimidated, only observant. "Can I help you?" Elias's voice was flat, carrying easily in the crisp air. It was not a question, but a dismissal. "Mr. Thorne?" she called back, her voice clear and steady. "My name is Clara Reed. I'm a journalist. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions." "I don't talk to reporters," Elias said, turning back to the chopping block as if the conversation was over. He picked up another log, the message clear: "You are not welcome here." He heard the crunch of her boots on the snow as she approached, stopping just short of where the dog stood guard. "I saw you in town the other day," she persisted. "You and Sheriff Hagan. I couldn't help but notice your conversation. It seemed intense." Elias brought the axe down with a sharp crack, splitting the log perfectly in two. He did not look at her. "Town business." "It didn't look like town business," Clara said, her tone becoming more serious. "It looked like an interrogation, and he seemed very interested in your dogs." That got his attention. He slowly straightened up and turned to face her. His eyes narrowed. "This is private property. I'd appreciate it if you left." "I will," she said, holding up her hands in a placating gesture. "But please, just hear me out. Those dogs are special, aren't they? They aren't strays. The way they carry themselves, the way they're watching me right now, it's not normal. I have a feeling you know that. And I have a feeling Sheriff Hagan does too." Elias's silence was his only answer. He was a fortress, and his walls were high. He had spent years pushing the world away, and he wasn't about to let this stranger in. Clara took a small step forward, her eyes fixed not on him, but on the dogs. "I'm not here to write a story about the reclusive veteran on the mountain," she said, her voice softening with what sounded like genuine sincerity. "I'm here because I think those animals are in trouble, and I think you are too. Whatever they're a part of, you're a part of it now, and facing it alone might not be the best option." Her words hit closer to home than he wanted to admit. The cold knot in his stomach that had formed after his talk with Hagan hadn't gone away. He had the distinct feeling of being watched, a tactical awareness that had kept him alive on more than one occasion. He glanced at Vesper, at the long silvery scar along her flank. These dogs had already seen battle. He couldn't let them face another one alone. With a deep, weary sigh, he rested the axe against the chopping block. "What do you want?" "The truth," Clara said simply. "I want to know where they came from. I'm good at finding things out, Mr. Thorne. It's what I do. I can look into records, make calls, connect dots that aren't meant to be connected. You have instincts and information about them that I don't. I have skills and resources you don't. Together, we might be able to figure out what's going on before Sheriff Hagan decides to escalate things." Elias looked from her determined face to the three dogs who were now looking at him, their intelligent eyes waiting for his command. He had sought solitude to escape from a world of conflict and violence, but it seemed to have found him anyway. And this time, he wasn't just fighting for himself. "The coffee is probably burnt," he said gruffly, turning toward the cabin, "but I'll make a fresh pot." It was the closest thing to an invitation he could manage. Clara gave a small, relieved smile and followed him. As he opened the door, Spectre, Shade, and Vesper filed in silently behind him. parting to let her pass, their eyes never leaving her. The fortress had been breached. An unlikely alliance had just been formed. The scent of brewing coffee and the low hum of a laptop filled the small cabin, creating a strange domesticity that felt foreign to Elias. 2 days had passed since Clara Reed had breached his solitude, and a tense but functional routine had emerged. She worked at his small wooden table, her laptop and a satellite modem transforming a corner of his refuge into an investigation hub. He went about his chores, the rhythmic thump of his axe and the silent presence of the dogs a constant backdrop to her furious typing. "I need to get a clear shot of those tattoos," Clara said, looking up from her screen. "The one on Spectre's ear and the one on Shade's shoulder. They're too precise to be random." Elias nodded, calling the dogs over with a low whistle. Spectre, ever stoic, submitted to the examination without protest, allowing Clara to gently fold his ear and photograph the small, intricate symbol tattooed on the inner skin. It was a stylized shield crossed by a single lightning bolt. Shade was more wary, but a reassuring hand from Elias on his back was enough to keep him steady as Clara captured an image of the identical mark on his shoulder. "These are high resolution," she explained, zooming in on the image on her camera's display. "Every detail matters." She uploaded the photos to her laptop, encrypted them, and attached them to an email. "I have a friend, Leo. We used to work together at a major newspaper before he left to start his own cybersecurity firm. He's a wizard with this kind of thing. He can analyze the design, check it against databases of military and corporate insignia, things I don't have access to." "Will he help?" Elias asked, his skepticism evident. "He owes me a favor," Clara said with a wry smile. "A big one. He'll help." She sent the email, and the small cabin fell silent again. The weight of the unknown hanging heavy in the air. The weight was nerve-wracking. For 3 days, they heard nothing. Elias grew more restless, his patrols around the cabin becoming more frequent. The dogs sensed his anxiety, their watchfulness intensifying. On the 4th day, the threat returned, not as a subtle inquiry, but as a blatant act of intimidation. Sheriff Hagen's cruiser appeared at the bottom of Elias's driveway, its lights off, simply sitting there like a predator waiting. He didn't get out this time. Instead, a metallic voice, distorted and amplified, crackled through the vehicle's public address system, shattering the mountain's peace. "Elias Thorne, this is Sheriff Hagen. I'm issuing a formal warning regarding the 3 unregistered canines on your property. Per County Regulation 3B, any animal deemed potentially aggressive or of unknown origin must be surrendered to animal control for a mandatory quarantine and behavioral assessment." Elias stepped out onto his porch, his face a mask of cold fury. Spectre, Shade, and Vesper flanked him, standing shoulder to shoulder, a silent wall of defiance. They did not growl or bark, their stillness a far greater threat. "There is no Regulation 3B, Sheriff," Elias shouted back, his voice raw. The metallic voice ignored him. "Failure to comply within 24 hours will result in the seizure of the animals and a fine. Consider this your only warning, Thorne." With that, the cruiser's engine roared to life, and the vehicle performed a slow, deliberate 3-point turn before driving away, leaving a trail of exhaust and menace in its wake. "He's not just pushing. He's trying to provoke you," Clara said, standing in the doorway behind him, her face pale. "He wants you to do something reckless, so he has a reason to act. He's going to get his wish if he keeps this up," Elias said through clenched teeth. That evening, as the last light faded from the sky, Clara's laptop chimed. An email had arrived. The subject line contained a single word: "Found." She opened it quickly, Elias leaning over her shoulder, the dogs sensing the shift in tension and gathering at their feet. The email from Leo was brief. Not military, not officially. The insignia belongs to a private military contractor, Vanguard Systems. Specifically, it's an internal unit marker for a now defunct Special Projects Division. Very secretive, very black budget. They called it Project Hydra. Be careful, Clara. These guys don't play. The name hit Elias like a physical blow. Vanguard Systems. He knew them. Every soldier who had served in the last 20 years knew them. They were a ghost army hired for jobs that governments wouldn't publicly sanction. They were known for their brutal efficiency and their complete lack of accountability. Clara's fingers flew across the keyboard. Project Hydra, Vanguard Systems. She dove into the digital rabbit hole, using Leo's lead to bypass the public-facing corporate propaganda. She found financial reports, redacted government contracts, and finally, in a dusty, forgotten corner of a public server, an appendix to a Congressional Oversight Committee report from 2 years prior. Most of it was blacked out, but one line had been missed by the censors. Funding for Project Hydra was terminated effective immediately following a significant asset containment failure during a field trial. Clara read the line aloud, her voice barely a whisper. Asset containment failure. They're not talking about equipment, are they? Elias looked down at the 3 magnificent animals sitting at his feet, at Spectre's quiet strength, Shade's watchful intelligence, and Vesper's alert loyalty. They weren't assets. They were soldiers, discarded soldiers. And the corporation that had made them, then thrown them away, now wanted to bury its secrets. The small-town harassment from Sheriff Hagen suddenly felt like the tremor before an earthquake. The real enemy had a name. And it was Vanguard Systems. The name Vanguard Systems cast a long, cold shadow over the following days. The small cabin, once a sanctuary from the world, now felt like a fragile outpost on the edge of a war zone. Clara worked relentlessly, her fingers a blur on the keyboard as she dug deeper into the corporate labyrinth of Vanguard. She uncovered a complex web of shell companies, government contracts, and a board of directors filled with ex-military brass and shadowy political figures. The more she found, the clearer it became that this was not just some rogue project. Hydra was a symptom of a much larger disease. Elias, for his part, fell back on old instincts. He secured the perimeter of the cabin, setting up simple but effective tripwires made from fishing line and empty cans. He cleaned his old hunting rifle, the scent of gun oil sharp in the air. He watched the tree line with a hawk's intensity, noting every broken branch, every unfamiliar track in the snow. He and the dogs moved as one, a silent 4-member patrol unit. The quiet peace he had cultivated for years had been shattered, replaced by the familiar humming tension of imminent conflict. The attack came on the 3rd night. A heavy wet snow had begun to fall, muffling the world in a blanket of white and erasing the stars. Inside the cabin, a single lamp cast a warm glow. Clara had finally fallen asleep, her head resting on a pile of printed documents at the table. Elias was on watch, sitting in his worn armchair, the rifle resting across his lap. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers. Spectre, Shade, and Vesper were asleep, their bodies forming a relaxed, furry pile near the warmth. Elias must have drifted off. One moment, he was staring into the dying fire. The next, he was jolted awake by a wet nose and a low, urgent whine. Vesper was standing over him, her body rigid, her nose nudging his hand insistently. He sat up, instantly alert. The cabin was unnaturally dark. The lamp had gone out, and there was a smell, acrid smoke, tinged with the sharp chemical scent of gasoline. At the same moment, Shade was at Clara's side, whining and pushing his head under her arm until she stirred, mumbling in confusion. Spectre was already at the door, not scratching or barking, but standing with his ears flat against his head. A low, guttural growl vibrating deep in his chest. "Smoke," Elias rasped, his throat already raw. He could see it now. A thick, black haze coiling near the ceiling. A wave of heat washed over them from the front of the cabin. The fire wasn't in the hearth. It was outside. It was everywhere. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up his throat. But years of training slammed it back down. "Clara, wake up! We have to get out now!" Clara was already on her feet, her eyes wide with terror as she took in the scene. The smoke was getting thicker, dropping lower, and the crackle of hungry flames was now audible. A terrifying roar that grew louder with every second. "The door is blocked!" Elias yelled over the sound. "The fire's on the porch!" They were trapped. The smoke stung their eyes and choked their lungs. Disorientation began to set in. But the dogs were not panicking. They were trained for chaos. Vesper let out a single sharp bark and ran toward the back of the cabin, toward the small window in Elias's sleeping area. Spectre and Shade immediately flanked Elias and Clara, pressing against their legs, guiding them, herding them away from the main room and the growing inferno. They stayed low, their bodies under the worst of the smoke. Coughing and stumbling, Elias followed Vesper's lead, pulling Clara along with him. The small bedroom was already filled with smoke, but it was less dense. Vesper was on her hind legs, her front paws on the windowsill, looking back at them with an intensity that demanded action. The window was small, but it was their only chance. Elias grabbed a heavy boot from the floor and smashed the glass. A rush of cold, clean air blasted in, a brief and blessed relief. "You first," he ordered Clara, helping her scramble through the opening. She fell into the soft snow outside, gasping for breath. Now it was his turn. As he started to climb through, he heard a terrifying groan from above. A section of the roof, heavy with snow and weakened by the fire, was beginning to give way. Shade and Spectre, seeing the danger, both lunged at him, pushing him with their heads and shoulders, forcing him through the window just as a shower of flaming debris crashed down where he had been standing. He landed hard beside Clara. They scrambled away from the cabin, turning just in time to watch the roof collapse inward, sending a volcano of sparks and embers into the night sky. The entire structure was a roaring column of fire, a funeral pyre for his quiet life. They stood there in the falling snow. A man, a woman, and 3 dogs, illuminated by the destructive orange glow. Elias's home, his sanctuary, the place where he had tried to piece his life back together, was gone. All he had left was the clothes on his back, a journalist he barely knew, and the 3 silent soldiers who had just saved his life. He looked down at them. Spectre, Shade, and Vesper stood calmly, their eyes fixed on the flames, their loyalty an unshakable anchor in the chaos. They had lost the battle for the cabin, but in the smoking ruins, a new resolve was forged. This was no longer just about uncovering a secret. It was about survival, and they were facing an enemy who would burn the world down to keep their secrets buried. The fire died as slowly and cruelly as it had been born, leaving behind a black skeletal ruin that steamed against the falling snow. The cold, which had been held at bay by the adrenaline of their escape, now sank its teeth into them. Shivering, clad only in the clothes they had been sleeping in, Elias and Clara stood with the dogs, their small group of survivors framed against the destruction. Despair was a luxury they could not afford. Survival was the only currency that mattered. "We can't stay here," Clara said, her voice trembling, her breath a white cloud in the frigid air. "Hagen will be back, or he'll send someone." Elias knew she was right. His mind, honed by years of battlefield assessments, raced through a series of bleak options. Every choice led to a dead end. The town was compromised. The wilderness in this weather without gear was a death sentence. They were exposed, hunted, and out of time. Then a name surfaced from the depths of his memory. A face. A rookie deputy he had helped pull from a wrecked car on an icy road a few years back. A good kid with honest eyes. "There's one person," Elias said, his voice a low growl. Maybe one. Deputy Evans. I knew his father. Can you trust him? Clara asked, her gaze searching his. After Hagen, I don't know, Elias admitted honestly. But right now, maybe is the best I've got. He took Clara's satellite phone. The only piece of technology to survive the fire, besides the clothes on their backs. He dialed the number for the sheriff's department from memory, his fingers clumsy with cold. When the dispatcher answered, he kept his voice low and even. I need to speak with Deputy Evans. It's an urgent personal matter. Tell him it's Thorn. The wait was agonizing. Every second felt like an hour, every gust of wind like an approaching footstep. Finally, a young, steady voice came on the line. Thorn? Elias, is that you? What's going on? Can't talk now, kid, Elias said. His words clipped. I'm in trouble. The kind you don't report. Do you remember the old fishing spot we talked about up on Swift River? There was a brief pause. I remember. Are you okay? Meet me there. 1 hour. Come alone. No radio. And Evans, be careful. Elias ended the call before the deputy could ask another question. The journey to the river was a brutal trek through knee-deep snow. The dogs, seemingly impervious to the cold, created a path, their powerful bodies pushing through the drifts. Spectre took the lead, with Shade and Vesper guarding their flanks, their heads constantly turning, scanning the darkness. They found a hollow beneath an overhang of rock by the frozen river and waited. It was a calculated risk, but Elias's gut told him it was the right one. Just under an hour later, the quiet crunch of boots on snow announced Evans's arrival. Deputy Ryan Evans was in his late 20s, tall and lean, with a boyish face that hadn't yet hardened with cynicism. His uniform was immaculate, but his eyes were filled with a deep, troubled concern. As he looked at Elias's singed clothes and exhausted face, he carried a large duffel bag. Elias, my God! Evans whispered, his gaze shifting from the smudged soot on their faces to the 3 silent dogs who watched him with unnerving intelligence. Your cabin. I heard the call come in. A training fire that got out of control, Hagen called it. I knew it was a lie. He's on their payroll, isn't he? Elias asked, getting straight to the point. Vanguard. Evans' jaw tightened. He gave a sharp, reluctant nod. For years, he handles their local security, makes problems disappear. I've suspected it for a long time, but I never had proof. He keeps me on night shifts and traffic duty, away from anything important. They burned me out, Elias said, his voice devoid of emotion. We have nowhere to go. Evans unzipped the duffel bag. Inside were thick winter coats, blankets, a first aid kit, and food. I figured as much. You can't stay in the open, but I have an idea. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. There's an old ranger station about 15 miles north of here. It was decommissioned back in the 90s. It's not on any current maps. The department uses it for storage sometimes, but no one's been up there in months. He paused, then added the crucial piece of information. There's something else. A few years ago, an old-timer lived up there off the grid, a guy named Henderson. Turns out, he used to be a trainer for Vanguard systems, left the company under some kind of a dark cloud. He became a recluse, paranoid, always talking about how they threw them away. He died of a heart attack last year. But if he was hiding from Vanguard, that station is the first place I'd look for whatever he was scared of. It was more than a shelter. It was a lead, a tangible thread in a web of shadows. I have a key, Evans said, pressing it into Elias's hand along with a map. I'll keep Hagen's attention focused elsewhere. I can be your eyes and ears inside. Just be careful, Elias. You're kicking a hornet's nest the size of this state. Elias clasped the young deputy's shoulder. A rare moment of connection. You're a good man, Ryan. Don't let this job change that. With a final worried look, Evans disappeared back into the trees. As the first hint of dawn began to gray the eastern sky, Elias, Clara, and the dogs set off again. Their new destination, a forgotten outpost in the heart of the wilderness. They were no longer just refugees. They were hunters, following a cold trail to a dead man's secrets. The old ranger station was a ghost. It stood in a small clearing, half reclaimed by the forest. Its windows dark and empty eyes staring out into the snow. The journey had been arduous, a 15-mile march through unforgiving terrain. Clara, unused to such physical exertion, was near her limit. Elias, running on pure adrenaline and the iron will of a soldier, pushed forward, breaking the trail. The dogs were the true masters of this environment, moving with an effortless power that shamed the humans' clumsy struggle. The key Evans had given them turned in the frozen lock with a reluctant screech. The air inside was frigid and smelled of dust, mice, and forgotten years. It was a single large room with a stone fireplace, a kitchenette caked in grime, and a few pieces of dilapidated furniture. It was bleak, but it was shelter. It was defensible. "First things first," Elias said, his voice echoing in the cold space. "We need a fire. Then we secure the area." While Clara, exhausted, huddled under a blanket Evans had provided, Elias and the dogs went to work. He found a stack of dry firewood in a covered lean-to, and soon a small, hesitant fire was crackling in the hearth, pushing back the oppressive cold. The dogs, meanwhile, performed a systematic sweep of the clearing. Their movements a familiar, reassuring ballet of tactical awareness. They established a perimeter, their presence turning the abandoned station into a temporary fortress. They spent the next day making the place habitable. Elias patched a broken window pane with a piece of plywood he found in a shed. Clara, having recovered some of her strength, tackled the grime inside, scrubbing surfaces and sweeping away layers of dust. It was mindless physical work that kept their thoughts from dwelling on the smoldering ruins of Elias's cabin and the faceless enemy that hunted them. It was on the second afternoon that Vesper found something. Elias and Clara were sharing a meager meal of canned beans when they noticed the female shepherd was not with the others. Spectre and Shade were resting by the fire, but Vesper was in the far corner of the room near an old, scarred wooden desk. She was acting strangely, whining softly, her nose pressed to the floorboards. She began to scratch at the wood, not frantically, but with a focused, deliberate intensity. "What is it, girl?" Elias asked, walking over to her. Vesper looked up at him, whined again, and then nudged a specific floorboard with her nose. It looked no different from the others, but her insistence was undeniable. She had found a scent, something the human nose could never detect, a lingering trace of something hidden. "She's onto something," Clara said, joining them. "Her sense of smell must be incredible." Elias knelt, running his fingers along the edges of the board Vesper had indicated. He found no seam, no handle. He pulled out his multi-tool and used the prying attachment to work at the edge. The old wood groaned in protest. But then, with a final, splintering crack, a section of the board lifted. Beneath it was not dirt, but a dark, hollow space, a secret compartment. Reaching inside, Elias's fingers brushed against the cold, smooth surface of metal. He pulled it out. It was a military-style footlocker, small and dented, but sealed tight. A shared electric silence filled the room. They carried the box over to the firelight. It wasn't locked. With trembling hands, Elias lifted the latches and opened the lid. The contents were a time capsule of a man's fear and guilt. On top was a thick, leather-bound folder. Beneath it, nestled in yellowing foam, was a ruggedized external hard drive. Clara reached for the folder first. The label on the front was handwritten in neat block letters. Project Hydra internal use only. She opened it, and the full, horrifying truth of Vanguard Systems' secret program spilled out. The pages were filled with training logs, psychological profiles of the dogs, and performance reports. The methods described were brutal and systematic, designed to strip away all canine instinct and replace it with unflinching, weaponized obedience. They read about Sheriff Hagen's role, listed as the local liaison for asset management and containment. He was their cleaner, the one who handled problems quietly. Then, near the bottom of the stack, Clara found a thin file marked with a red tab. The title was Asset Transport Incident Report. She read it aloud, her voice shaking. On the night of the winter storm, a transport vehicle carrying 3 Hydra assets designated S1, S2, and V3 was en route to a designated disposal facility for decommissioning. She looked at Elias, her eyes wide. Decommissioning. They were going to kill them, she continued. The vehicle encountered extreme weather conditions on a mountain pass and left the road. The transport cage was compromised, allowing the assets to escape before recovery personnel could arrive. The assets are considered lost in the wilderness. It was all there. The reason, the impossible coincidence that had led 3 highly trained soldiers to his doorstep half dead in the snow. They weren't just abandoned. They were survivors of their own execution. Henderson, Elias said, the name of the former trainer finally clicking into place. He hid this. He knew they would come looking for it. Clara looked from the documents to the key Evans had given them, to the map that had led them here. Evans, she whispered. He didn't just give us a place to hide. He suspected this was here. He knew about Henderson. He led us right to it. It wasn't a random act of kindness. It was a calculated move. A young deputy trapped in a corrupt department had used them to uncover the proof he could never get on his own. He had pointed a weapon he couldn't fire himself, and trusted them to pull the trigger. They looked at the box, at the files, at the hard drive. They weren't just holding secrets anymore. They were holding the key to bringing down an empire. The discovery of the Hydra files transformed the cold, dusty ranger station into the nerve center of a war. The hard drive was the bombshell, but the paper documents were the fuse. They had the what, the who, and the why. Now they needed to light the match. The hard drive is encrypted, Clara said. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she examined the ruggedized device, military grade. But the files Henderson left, it looks like he included a text file with the password. He wanted this found. She looked at her laptop, its battery icon blinking a fatalistic red. None of which matters if I don't have power. Elias's mind was already working. My truck. The battery is still good. I have an inverter that plugs into the lighter. It's low tech, but it'll work. Under the cover of a moonless night, they made their way to where Elias had concealed the old pickup in a thicket of pines. While the dogs established a silent, watchful perimeter, Elias carefully hooked up the inverter. A small green light blinked on inside the truck's cab. Huddled together for warmth, Clara plugged in her laptop. The screen flickered to life, a beacon of hope in the oppressive darkness. There's one person I can trust, she said, her fingers flying across the keys. My old editor at the Washington Chronicle. His name is Marcus Hale. He's old school. He values truth over access. If I can convince him, he'll move mountains for this story. She initiated a secure video call. A moment later, a man's face appeared on the screen. Marcus Hale was in his late 50s, with tired, intelligent eyes, a fringe of gray hair, and the perpetually skeptical expression of a man who had seen it all. Read, he said, his voice a low gravel. It's 2 a.m. This had better be the story of the century. It is, Marcus, Clara said, her voice steady and urgent. She didn't waste time. She laid out the facts, holding up the tattooed photos, showing him the cover of the Hydra file. She told him about Elias, about the dogs, about the fire, about Sheriff Hagen. She shared her screen and showed him the password file Henderson had left behind. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression slowly changing from weary skepticism to focused intensity. He had built his career on sniffing out lies, and he knew the scent of truth when he encountered it. This is dynamite, Clara, he said when she had finished. But it's dangerous. Vanguard Systems has lawyers that chew up journalists for breakfast. Everything has to be ironclad. It is, she insisted. The hard drive will prove it. I'm decrypting it now. It has videos, internal memos, financial records linking Hagen to their payroll. Everything. Send it all to my secure server, Marcus commanded. All traces of sleepiness gone. I'll get our legal team on it immediately. I'll tell them to work all night. You write the story. Write it like your life depends on it, because it just might. The call ended. For the next several hours, the cab of the truck became a newsroom. Clara wrote with a ferocity she hadn't felt in years, fueled by coffee from a thermos and the sheer gravity of their discovery. She wove a narrative of corporate greed, government overreach, and the silent suffering of the animals caught in the middle. Elias sat in the passenger seat, his rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the dark woods. Spectre, Shade, and Vesper lay in the snow outside, their heads up, ears swiveling, a living security system. By dawn, it was done. A 10,000-word expose, complete with scanned documents, photos, and links to the decrypted video files. She hit send. The story, titled The Ghosts of Project Hydra, went live on the Washington Chronicle's website at noon that day. Marcus had put the full weight of the paper behind it, placing it on the front page above the fold. The impact was immediate and explosive. It didn't just make a splash. It was a digital tsunami. The article was shared hundreds of thousands of times within the first hour. The hashtag Project Hydra began trending nationally. The video clips Clara had uploaded, showing the brutal training methods, went viral, sparking a firestorm of public outrage. Animal rights organizations, veterans groups, and civil liberties advocates all issued furious statements. By mid-afternoon, every major news network was leading with the story. The governor of Montana, who had previously accepted large campaign donations from Vanguard Systems' CEO, was cornered by a mob of reporters. He stammered his way through a promise of a full, swift, and transparent investigation. Vanguard Systems was caught completely off guard. Their first response was a hastily written press release that reeked of panic. They categorically denied all allegations, dismissing them as a baseless smear campaign orchestrated by a disgruntled former employee and calling the evidence fabricated. But the dam had broken. The evidence was too overwhelming. The public anger too visceral. Back in the cold, silent ranger station, Clara refreshed the page on her phone, which was now getting a weak signal. They watched the story they had unleashed tear across the world. They were no longer hiding. They were at the center of the storm. The storm they had unleashed online was followed by an eerie, tense silence. For a full day, Elias, Clara, and the dogs remained at the ranger station, a temporary island in the middle of a hurricane they could only observe from a distance. Clara's phone buzzed incessantly with calls and texts from news outlets around the world, all of which she ignored. Their next move had to be precise. The call came from Evans on the second day. "They're trying to get ahead of it," he said, his voice low and rushed. "Hagen just announced an emergency town hall meeting tonight at the community center. He and some lawyers from Vanguard are going to address the baseless allegations and reassure the public. It's a sham, Elias. They're going to try and paint you as a crazy, disgruntled vet, and Clara as a fame-hungry reporter. Let them," Elias said calmly, a cold resolve in his voice. "We'll be there." "Good," Evans replied. "That's what I was hoping you'd say. The world is watching Silver Pines right now. This is your stage. I've also made a call to a friend of my father's. I can't promise anything, but if things go sideways, we might not be alone." That evening, the Silver Pines Community Center, a simple log building that usually hosted potlucks and bingo nights, was the center of the universe. It was packed to the rafters, a tense mix of lifelong residents with worried faces, outraged animal lovers who had driven in from neighboring states, and a swarm of national media, their cameras and microphones creating a forest of technology. On the stage, Sheriff Hagen stood at a podium looking uncomfortable in his dress uniform. Flanking him were two men in impeccably tailored suits that screamed, "Expensive lawyer." They were the face of Vanguard dynamics, calm, condescending, and oozing a corporate confidence that was completely at odds with the anger simmering in the room. "I know there are a lot of concerns," Hagen began, his voice amplified by the microphone, but still sounding weak. "These wild accusations, published without any fact-checking, have hurt our town." One of the lawyers stepped forward. His name was Sterling, and he had the polished, predatory smile of a shark. "Let me be clear," Sterling said smoothly. "The allegations made against Vanguard Systems are not only false, they are libelous. Mr. Thorne is a man with a known history of instability, and Ms. Reed is a disgraced journalist looking for a comeback. There is no Project Hydra. There are no abused animals. It is a complete fabrication." A murmur of dissent rippled through the crowd. Sterling ignored it. "Sheriff Hagen has served this community with honor for 20 years. To suggest he is involved in some grand conspiracy is absurd. We have filed." He never finished the sentence. The heavy double doors at the back of the hall swung open with a loud bang. Every head turned. A collective gasp went through the room. Elias stood there, framed in the doorway. He wore his old leather jacket, his face grim and set. Beside him was Clara, her expression a mask of determination, and flanking them, moving with a silent, regal grace, were Spectre, Shade, and Vesper. They entered not as pets, but as soldiers, their heads held high, their intelligent eyes scanning the crowd with an unnerving calm. Deputy Evans walked in behind them, his hand resting on his service weapon, his face a clear statement of where his loyalties lay. The room fell into a stunned, absolute silence. The only sound was the soft padding of the dog's paws on the wooden floor as they walked down the central aisle. The crowd parted for them, as if for royalty. Elias didn't go to the stage. He stopped in the middle of the aisle, turning to face the community. He didn't need a microphone. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried with a commander's authority to every corner of the room. "My name is Elias Thorne," he began. "I served this country for 22 years. I came here looking for peace. I found these dogs half dead in the snow. I didn't know where they came from, only that they were hurt and needed help." He told them everything. He spoke of the tattoos, the threats from Hagen, the fire that had destroyed his home and nearly taken his life. His words were simple, direct, and devastatingly honest. Sterling, the lawyer, seeing his narrative collapsing, tried to interrupt. "This is a circus. Sheriff, do your duty." But Elias wasn't finished. He gestured to the 3 dogs who now sat perfectly still at his feet, their gaze fixed on him. "Vanguard Systems tells you there are no abused animals. They call my story a fabrication." He looked around the room, making eye contact with his neighbors. "Look at them. Look at the scars on their bodies. Look at the numbers tattooed into their ears. These aren't just dogs. They are veterans just like me. They served a cause they were trained for, and when they were no longer useful, they were marked for death and thrown away like trash." A woman in the front row began to cry. The anger in the room had transformed into a raw, shared emotion. Hagen, his face purple with rage and panic, finally snapped. "That's enough," he bellowed. "You are under arrest for inciting a riot. Evans, arrest this man." Deputy Evans did not move. He simply looked at his boss and gave a slight shake of his head. "No, sir. I don't believe I will." "You're fired," Hagen shrieked, his hand going instinctively toward his gun. "I'll do it myself." But before he could take a single step, the main doors burst open again. This time, it was a dozen figures in dark windbreakers with bold yellow letters on the back. FBI. They moved into the room with quiet, disciplined efficiency. At their head was a tall, stern-faced agent who held up a badge. "Sheriff Hagen," the agent announced, her voice cutting through the pandemonium. "You are under arrest. So are you, Mr. Sterling, and you, Mr. Davies." She nodded to the other lawyer. "By order of the United States Department of Justice, you are being charged with conspiracy, animal cruelty, attempted murder, and a host of other federal crimes. As the agents moved forward, snapping handcuffs onto a stunned Hagen and the suddenly pale lawyers, the community center erupted. The flash of cameras was blinding. In the eye of the hurricane stood Elias, Clara, and Evans. Elias reached down and rested his hand on Specter's head. The big shepherd leaned into his touch, a silent acknowledgement. The battle was over. Justice, carried on the backs of 3 loyal survivors, had finally come to Silver Pines. The arrests at the town hall meeting were not the end of the story. They were the beginning of a reckoning. In the weeks that followed, the case against Vanguard Systems and Sheriff Hagen became a national obsession. The federal trial was swift and damning. The contents of Henderson's hard drive, combined with the testimony of other former trainers who came forward after Clara's article, painted a picture of systemic cruelty and corruption that horrified the country. The executives, the lawyers, and Hagen were all found guilty and sentenced to long prison terms. The corporation itself was dismantled, its assets seized, its name forever a synonym for disgrace. But as the legal storm raged, a different kind of story was unfolding. It was the story of a reclusive veteran and the 3 loyal dogs who had saved his life. It was a story that resonated deeply with millions of people. Elias, Clara, and the dogs became reluctant celebrities. Their images were everywhere. Donations began to pour in, unsolicited, to a post office box set up by the town's new interim mayor. First, it was a trickle. A $20 bill from a pensioner, a $50 check from a fellow veteran, a jar of coins collected by a classroom of school children. Then the Washington Chronicle, led by Marcus Hale, officially partnered with a national veterans charity to create the Silver Pines Survivors Fund. The response was overwhelming. The fund grew from thousands to hundreds of thousands, and then to over $1 million. The money was earmarked to rebuild Elias's home and to ensure the lifelong care of Specter, Shade, and Vesper. Elias was profoundly uncomfortable with the attention. He was a private man who had never asked for anything. He sat in the temporary housing the town had provided for him and Clara, watching the news reports with a sense of disbelief. "I can't take this money, Clara," he said one evening, gesturing to a printout of the fund's staggering total. "It's not right. We didn't do this for money." "It's not a payment, Elias," Clara replied gently. She had stayed in Silver Pines, her series on small towns forgotten in favor of the story that had changed her life. "It's a thank you from a country that needed to be reminded what honor and loyalty look like. The question is, what do you want to do with it?" He could rebuild his cabin bigger and better than before. He could disappear back into his quiet life, this time with a comfortable nest egg. But as he looked at Specter, Shade, and Vesper, who were dozing peacefully by his feet, he knew that going back was impossible. He wasn't the same man who had lived in isolation on that ridge. They had saved him, not just from a fire, but from the ghosts of his past. He owed them, and all the others, like them, something more. "There are others," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Other dogs from Hydra that weren't commissioned. Other service animals. Police canines, military dogs. They get old, they get injured, and they get forgotten. They deserve better." An idea, born from the ashes of his old life, began to take shape. It was a bold, audacious idea. He wouldn't just rebuild his home. He would build a sanctuary. With the help of a pro bono lawyer arranged by Clara's paper, Elias used a large portion of the fund to purchase a 100-acre ranch in a rolling valley 20 miles from Silver Pines. It was a beautiful piece of land, with a clear running stream, wide open pastures, and groves of aspen trees. They called it the Guardian's Haven. The news of his plan reignited public interest, and this time, the support was not just financial. Volunteers came from all over the country. Local contractors donated their time and materials. A team of architects who had read the story designed the facility for free. Chief Evans, now promoted, organized off-duty officers to help with the construction on weekends. Over the next year, the haven rose from the Montana soil. It was not a kennel or a shelter. It was a community. There were spacious, comfortable living quarters for the animals, a state-of-the-art veterinary clinic, and physical therapy facilities. There was a large, quiet house where Elias now lived. The Guardian's Haven opened its doors in the fall. Its first residents were 5 other surviving dogs from the Hydra program, tracked down and rescued from various facilities by the FBI. Soon they were joined by retired police dogs, aging bomb-sniffing Labradors, and former military shepherds. Each one came with a story, with scars both visible and invisible. Elias was no longer a hermit. He was a healer. He rose before the sun each day, his life now filled with purpose. He spent his hours working with the animals, understanding their trauma, and patiently helping them learn how to be dogs again. Clara was a permanent fixture. Her laptop and camera now used to tell the stories of the Haven's residents. Her articles inspiring similar sanctuaries to open up across the country. One crisp autumn evening, Elias stood on the porch of his new home, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands. The valley was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Below, he could see a dozen dogs playing in a large fenced pasture. He saw a fellow veteran, a young man who had lost a leg in Afghanistan, throwing a ball for a retired German, short-haired pointer. He saw Clara talking with a veterinarian near the clinic. A familiar weight pressed against his leg. He looked down. Spectre, Shade, and Vesper were there. Their bodies relaxed, their eyes soft. Their mission was over. They were home. Elias rested his hand on Spectre's broad head, the bond between them a silent, unbreakable truth. The ghosts of his past were finally quiet, replaced by the gentle, steady rhythm of a life rebuilt on the foundations of loyalty, courage, and a second chance for forgotten soldiers of every species.